Hello and welcome back, and that's right, we're testing another M.2 SSD inside our PS5 expansion bay. There's been a number of SSD tested in the past, and this is going to be another video. And for those of you that have been following the other videos that mentioned in the comments, good God, this is getting repetitive, looking at the same games in the same subject. I get that, I really do. Imagine how I feel testing these games over and over again. However, there are going to be people that are searching for individual SSDs that have not watched the back catalogue, and therefore I've got to repeat the test. It's got to be fair for everyone, and today is just such a video. Now, today we are looking at the Sabrent Rocket. Now, for those that aren't aware or have wondered, we have actually tested a Sabrent in the past. If we flick over to the web browser here and we have a look, we can see this SSD here, known as the Sabrent Rocket 4 Plus. Now, the Sabrent Rocket 4 Plus is a PCIe Gen 4 SSD, and it can achieve performance benchmarks of 7,100 megabytes per second read and 6,600 megabytes per second sequential write. But again, bear in mind that write is less important here. However, that's one we've tested before. The one we're testing today is the Rocket. It's Sabrent's more affordable PCIe4 SSD. Now, this takes advantage of PCIe Gen 4, but it utilizes a lesser controller in the Phison E16. Now, this SSD reaches performance benchmarks of 5,000 megabytes per second read and 4,400 megabytes per second write. Why is that important? Because the PlayStation has a recommended minimum of 5,500 sequential read. So why would a person consider this SSD? Why have people requested a test of this drive? It's because of the price difference. Now, the standard Rocket class, the one in the black, currently retails on different websites for about $150. The price does alter from place to place, but right now on Amazon.com it's $159. However, the Rocket Plus recently had a price cut for this weekend, but it's normally $199. It's for a discount now at $179, but more generally it's around for about $200. That's a big price jump of $40 to $50 typically shopping around. That's a lot of money to save for a 1 terabyte drive, and indeed that price does scale as you go through each of the higher capacities. Even on Sabrent's own website, there's a notable price difference there between them of $499 for the Plus and $429 for the standard class drive. And what we're going to do today is we're going to bench test the performance of this drive in 2 terabytes on our PS5. Now, again, we're going to be bench testing the same games we've done before. We're going to be getting the PlayStation's own benchmarks. Let's do that now. And again, we have tested the Rocket Plus in the past, and now we're looking at here, and the PlayStation has rated this drive at 5,622 megabytes per second sequential read, which is super peculiar, given that Sabrent themselves volunteer this drive at 5,000. Now, it's worth highlighting, I'm not massively recommending the use of under-recommended benchmark drives. I'm performing this test because it's one you guys have asked for. And in this test, we're going to be looking at a number of games we've looked at before, Demon Souls, Ratchet & Clank, Resident Evil, Doom and GTA, to see how this drive fares in the loading screens and the game handling. We're also going to be doing some read-write testing as well. So let's make our way into the PlayStation user interface and begin the testing of the Sabrent Rocket 2TB drive. So we're on the desktop here, and again we are recording this video in OBS, so there will be pixelation. I'm really sorry about that. We are outputting 4K on this PlayStation, and it's going into a 1080p 30 frames per second capture card, which does lead to a little bit of pixelation there, so I do apologise. Also, later on in the video we will be putting side by side the benchmarks of this SSD versus the internal SSD, just to see how that performance fares. Now, the games we're going to be utilising today, we will transfer those over shortly, but before we go any further, let's go into the storage manager, into the M.2 SSD storage area, and boom, there is our Sabrent Rocket 4, not the Plus version. There's 2TB, and the next thing we're going to do is copy a big old pile of games over. So, first and foremost, let's go into the transfer menu and move those games over into the system. So from there, we scroll on down. We're going to move Grand Theft Auto Doom, Resident Evil Village, Ratchet and Clank, and Demon's Souls. So again, that's around 367 gigabytes of data, which we're going to move onto the system. And we're going to talk a little bit about this. Now again, I know how repetitious this is for some of you guys that have watched the other videos, that have seen me perform these tests over and over. And for those guys, thank you for subscribing and watching, and I appreciate it is quite repetitious. But for people that have just found this video, let me talk about some stuff. Now, we're copying this over, but even though we're reading from the PlayStation's internal SSD and writing to that Sabrent Rocket drive, and both of these drives, the internal SSD has an incredible read performance of 5,500 at least, and the destination SSD has a sequential write of 4,000 megabytes per second or so. Even though we're only moving 360 gig of data, it's actually quite slow. Now the reason for that is because in the middle of the process between the PlayStation and the SSD, there is definitely some kind of encryption, some kind of verification, some kind of compression. There is activity happening as data is being passed over to the drive. Perhaps checksums on the block level, maybe some kind of anti-piracy measure, we're not sure. But the result is that transferring data between storage media, internal SSD onto M2, M2 onto USB, all of these, there's definitely a bottleneck in the middle, and therefore we can't really gauge this drive in terms of transfer there. In the past, when we transferred over 230 gigabytes of data in other videos, even though we've compared something like 12 to 13 drives so far, all of those drives took 8 minutes to transfer 240 gig of data. It didn't matter how fast the drive was because of that bottleneck there in the middle. So we're not judging this console by the moving of data from one media to another, because there's definitely activity in the middle. But for now, let's fast forward to the completion of moving this data and start bench testing the load times on all 5 of our games. Right, so the transfer has completed. Let's get on and test some games. First game we're going to be looking at is, of course, Demon's Souls. It was one of the launch titles with the console PS5 back in November, and it's very much one of those games that takes advantage of the large amount of performance in sequential read that the internal PlayStation's SSD can give. So what we're going to do is make our way into this game. We're going to load from a save spot in an offline state and load into the Nexus area of the game. Now, a number of people have queried, why am I not judging a lot of these games by the load directly from the user interface? Well, you're looking at the reason. A lot of the time, when you are booting games directly from the system, you have to go through all the publisher logos, and it takes forever. Also, when you move data between the internal system and the SSD, for some reason, one of the things that gets forgotten is that you've played the game before as far as the opening titles go. And although once you've played Demon's Souls once, you never have to worry about those developer logos and you can skip them. Once you move a game over to the M2 SSD area, for some reason it forgets that and you have to sit through the publisher logos again, which is super annoying. So every time I do these tests, I've got to do it over again. And that's why we don't include it from the main XMB. Also because there's too many options in the way. Now we're loading this game from offline mode. So we're going to be coming from here. We're going to put them on screen side by side and we're going to load these games together. And we're going to make sure that the Sabrent Rocket can keep pace with the PlayStation's own internal SSD. 3, 2, 1. So we're going to load into the Nexus world. This normally takes 2 to 3 seconds. And I'll be honest, that felt pretty spot on. That felt exactly the same as the other one there. And we're in the main Nexus world. It's lovely and straightforward. I think we've got that there. We've got all the resources around us. We can spin that round. There's no poor texture pop there. There's nothing really for us to worry about. There's no drop in frame rate. And for me, that suits me absolutely fine. So we're going to go to the next test. We're going to load up the Stonefang Tunnel area into the first area. We're going to put them side by side. 3, 2, 1. This normally takes around 6 seconds on the internal SSD. Remember, I can't see both of these side by side, only you can there. We're loading into it there. That felt the tiniest pinch slower. I think maybe on the edit it will show that I was in the wrong there, but the whole world seemed to have loaded there. We've got all the textures. There's no draw distance problems there. There's no difficulties there with loading a lot of the assets. No drop in performance there, no pop. I think we're absolutely fine there. And again, the game has loaded exactly how we would want it to. So from here, we're in the game. Things are loading fine. To be perfectly honest, you'd think I haven't played this game before. I definitely have. I've completed this and the original. But for now, it is just a question of trying to do 3 things at once. Even if we go outside, we can check out the vista there outside. And looking absolutely fine. No poor textures, no pop. Everything's absolutely fine. Let's make our way back to the Nexus world. I know I could just use a Homeward Bone or something like that, or whatever the equivalent is in Demon Souls. But we're doing this here just to make sure that the assets are still being rendered in the effects and we don't see any clipping there with some of the ray tracing as well. So we're going to make our way back to the Nexus as we make our way into it here. And then we can load the initial area of the game. And then from there, we are going to bench test the loading time for that as well. Here we are at the other Archstone. So for here, let's go in 3, 2, 1. So we're making our way in, see how they compare. We're loading up and boom, we're in the beginning of the game. Absolutely fine, we've got all the assets there all around us, it's all loaded. It's comparing, I imagine, very well against the internal SSD. All of the assets are there, all the smoke and stuff at the top. None of these textures have gone low poly while we're doing it there. If we bring some of them closer to screen. Running along, trying to push the system to have difficulty with asset building. I think we're absolutely fine there. All the textures are exactly how we like them. And again, pretty successful stuff there. I'm pleased to say that that all looks good by my mind. So I think that's enough for this game here. We can make our way on to the next test game. Oh, there we go. That's the end of that. Let's make our way on to the next game, Ratchet and Clank. Okay, so once again, we're making our way into that game here. And again, as we've moved it on from the internal to the external storage or M2 external storage, we can't skip these logos. Super annoying there. But we will be bench testing the same 2 usual save areas for Ratchet and Clank. The first one is at the start of the game. The second one is that large Rift Rouse transition period. But for now, let's go with the beginning of the game. And load that save up there. We're going to continue from here. 3, 2, 1. Yep, pretty good there. I'll be honest, it felt a little slower. And we did come across a period a short while ago when we saw some slight clipping when we went for some other lower performance PCIe Gen 3 cards. We're not really seeing that here. And again, although this is a semi-rail section, there's a lot of asset building here. So what I know it's a little bit pixelated there in the recordings. But just look out for the background graphics, anything that's not popping in or out correctly, maybe low texture polys. I know it's very tough to make that out in what you're seeing here on screen. But for now, we'll make our way into the slight area there before we go into a transitional cutscene. And right now, I know you can hear the vibration of my controller and it's super annoying. I'm just trying to get as much animation happening on screen as possible to try and push the system a little bit in any way that we can during this. But for now, I think we're all absolutely fine. I've not seen any texture problems like I saw in one of the real budget SSDs we tested a while ago. But for now, things seem absolutely fine. We can make our way in. Hopefully we've got that there for the next part. And then we fire away like we normally would. Create a bunch of graphical, not inconsistencies, but stuff on screen. But for now, we've got that cutscene starting there. And I think that'll do us absolutely fine for now. Let's move in to the other save spot. Once again, this is that on rails transitional area. And yes, it is on rails, but it should be highlighted. There's still a lot of graphical creation during this period. We have elements of control and there's lots of variables. So once again, try to look at these parts here in terms of the fidelity of the graphics, any drops in frame rate. Do look out for anything to do with graphics popping in the background, and look out for anything where it seems like certain graphics are not comparable to the internal SSD in case things are getting scaled back. 3, 2, 1. So there's our transitional area where we go through different parts of the game, and again we have a huge degree of control, bringing that all up there, sort of pushing through. We've got all the different stuff happening at once as we move between different level areas. And again, making sure we're doing things ever so slightly differently at each juncture where possible. And again, things still seem pretty fine to me. I've done this quite a few times now. this whole area, but for me right now this still seems to be running fairly normal and standard. Now we're going to the pirate world, I believe, on the ship as we make our way through into the next part. And for now this seems fine. We've got no texture problems. We've never really looked around at this whole region, to be honest. But there we go, we're going straight into the cutscene there, and that's pretty much where we wrap it up, because from this point it's clearly a cutscene that's not going to have too much of an impact there. But for now, let's come out of this game and make our way into the next game, which is Resident Evil Village. And there's the Resident Evil Village splash screen there. Again, we're not testing this up from the boot sequence. I'm going to include the boot sequence there, but just to show you that there's not much change there, we can skip through that mostly. But again, it's very hard to gauge that when we're just rapidly spamming X to go through those options. And again, we've got the two same save slots we always run with. We've got Escape the Castle and going from that, running through the entire map. So let's go with Escape the Castle. And again, loading it from this no online connectivity. 3, 2, 1. Lovely and quick there. Again, I do think that was pretty much on par with the main console. As we go through and make sure we don't get messed up by Lady Dimitrescu. Let's go through there, and let's face it, I just took a hell of a hit there. But again, as we go through to try and create different assets within the game, I think for now, I think that's running fine. We can run in. I know it's a little dark for you guys there. I can't help it. This is quite a dark game. But don't worry, the second save spot's got plenty of outside stuff going on. I think we can gauge that for now, I think. I think we're absolutely fine there. Let's go into the second save spot there. Head back to the title screen and compare them against one another. And from this save spot, we're going to make our way from that main area. Where is it? Near the altar. We're going to go for the stronghold, and boom, let's go for the stronghold. 3, 2, 1. That felt like it took a pinch longer than normal, if I'm honest. I felt a tiny moment there. Maybe it won't be the same. As you can see, what we do in this save spot is we run through a large area of the map while we run through the stronghold, one of the splintered off areas of the map, and we run through to push the system to have to create all of these assets all the way along. And we make our way through there, pushing there. Occasionally, what we're looking for to see is a hidden loading wall there, a bit where the game needs us to pause slightly so it can gather up the assets, something we always associate with slower performance, internal resources being gathered. So for now, we're running through to make our way all the way back to the original village on this game and pushing through around 4, possibly 4.5 areas while we go through it to make our way back to the village. And from here, we'll make our way back to the merchant at the altar to double check that 1, there's no slowdown, 2, there's no pop, 3, that none of the assets in the background. That's another thing you should be looking out for, that the assets in the background aren't being created on the fly, therefore showing that there's problems there as we go. But for now, making our way back to the altar. There's been no slowdown, no low texture polys. We're absolutely fine there. And there is the merchant. Lovely quick stuff there. Always good. Let's make our way onto our second to last game, Doom Eternal PS5. Okay, so here we are on the desktop of Doom Eternal. A few people have asked about the mode in which we are running with. And again, as mentioned previously before, we are running this game in full ray tracing mode there. So we've got a lot of graphical manipulation happening there in the background to get the best possible playback on this. A lot of people have queried, why do I keep including Doom Eternal? This is probably one of the last times I'm going to include this game, but the reason I've included it is this is one of those games that has a very high targeted performance frames per second, and also is one of the games you can tell very early on when the system's struggling about resources and how graphics, with the scaling of some of the resolution of it, when you do a lot of the glory kills, when you're running around and getting very close to the enemies on the PS4 against the PS4 Pro, one of the earliest things that was noticed in the PS4 version was when your system was hanging or struggling, you would get up close to a lot of the enemies while you're performing glory kills and running around at top speed, and you notice the textures drop dramatically, like really, really bad. So now they upscaled this game for the PS5. That is one of the things we look out for when we're bench testing the speed of graphics being pulled. Now that it's even larger scale textures being pulled on this high density system. But for now, let's load our save. 3, 2, 1. Going in, and again, same save spot should be side by side on screen for you guys there. And again, as mentioned, you get nice and close to some of the enemies for a glory kill, just to see how they compare, because you notice those low texture polys quite quickly. I know sometimes it's a little slow, but you will notice them when the game is struggling, and that's kind of the main reason we include this game in our range, because the textured polys stand out an absolute mile when you spot them. Maybe on another video I should take a moment just to show exactly what that looks like to make that point clearer. But for now, I think that's absolutely fine what we're seeing there on screen. And for now, we can probably make our way into the next game. And I say our next game, our last game no less, where we're going to be looking at Grand Theft Auto 5. So let's not waste any time. Let's not even cut out the game to do this. Let's do that. We're not even going to chop this up. Why do we include Grand Theft Auto even though it is a PS4 title? Well, Grand Theft Auto 5 still has an insane loading time. Yes, some people worked on it to get that loading time improved, but there's still no denying it that Grand Theft Auto 5 still has, for a game that's been around since PS3 and now PS4 and a PS5 version coming later this year, it's still one of the slowest loading games out there, and it's one of the key reasons why we bench test how quickly it loads from the internal PlayStation SSD versus that of the M.2 SSD. But for now, let's load the game. 3, 2, 1. And then we're going to see these two games loading side by side. It's worth highlighting, despite this game being a PS4 upscale title, being played on a PS5 with the internal storage, when we compared this game around about a week ago, when we looked at comparing it against the WD Black versus the Firecuda 530 versus the Sabrent Rocket 4 Plus versus the Samsung 980 Pro, on all four of those SSDs, the WD Black loaded the game an enormous degree quicker. Obviously, this is by varying degrees, but it definitely loaded the game noticeably faster thanks to that WD Black SSD. So it's going to be very interesting to see if we see lesser performance or matched internal SSD performance on this lower spec PCIe4 SSD there on screen. Again, it feels like it was slightly slower, but again, that's mainly my recollection. I don't have them side by side the way you do on screen there. So it's quite important. And what we're going to do is just do some quick driving around to see if we see any pop, we see any low texture polygon graphics there, any low res stuff, or we see any of this stuff being generated there in the background in a way that would kind of show that the SSD is not performing with any kind of sustained activity. Because it's worth highlighting, it's not just about that the SSD has that performance. We need to know it can have that performance sustained over time as more and more data is drawn from on the SSD over time. And as a lot of SSDs, this is kind of a stumbling block for a lot of gaming SSDs for PC generation, where an SSD has great spike performance and sequential performance, but sustained kind of draw as much data as possible. That is where they can sometimes fall. But I think this SSD is still holding up pretty well indeed. Even though I've stopped there, I saw no instances there of graphics being kind of conjured or some of the low-res polys being introduced on the road or surrounding area as you max out the amount of graphics being generated there over time. So I'm going to come out of this game now. In fact, literally, let's just jump out. What's the worst that could happen? That, apparently. And make our way back into the PlayStation menu and summarise what we've learned today as we move the games back onto the console there. Because again, we're not really going to analyse the read-write. As mentioned earlier on, there is that internal bottleneck, and we're moving all 360 gig back onto the internal performing SSD. And look at what we've seen. Now, all of these games seemingly load fine today. There was absolutely no slowdown from what I could see in terms of frames per second, in terms of graphical creation there in the background. We saw no low texture polys at any point, and maybe in the post edit, if I do notice it with any background stuff from their side by side, I will highlight that. But if you haven't seen it, then chances are it wasn't there when I go through the analysis in the post production. But I'm still not sure about drives that are under 5,500 megabytes per second. There's a reason Sony would recommend that as a minimum. Now, perhaps the internal SSD in the PlayStation maxes out at 5,500 megabytes per second, because it was released at the end of 2020 when there were very, very few SSDs at that price point that would have exceeded that. Yes, the Samsung 980 and the WD Black were around with 7,000 sequential read, but again, they were not cheap at that point, and given the PlayStation's price point at £450, I think that would have been problematic in the extreme and would have ramped up prices significantly, hence the storage amount in the base level PlayStation. Now, later on, when Sony rolls out support of M.2 SSDs outside of the beta in more established form, in a massive firmware update, it's worth remembering that they may change the rules on compatibility. Maybe they'll introduce and allow drives of this capacity, or they'll hardlock the system to not allow drives that are under that performance benchmark. Remember, when we loaded this console, it rated this SSD, the Sabrent Rocket, the non-plus Rocket, the more affordable PCIe Gen 4 SSD, at 5,600 megs, higher than the brand themselves. Confusing? Yes. We don't know whether that is because of the console or because of the SSD. We've done reviews on this drive. We couldn't get it to reach 5,600, and we were using a 6-core i5 11th gen 16 gig test rig with PCIe Gen 4. So for now, although this drive works very, very well, and I do think it will give you performance at a much more affordable price point, perhaps you should wait until the beta has ended and full support of the M.2 SSD bay arrives. And if this drive is within that compatibility spectrum, I do recommend it, because I've seen nothing here today that doesn't tell me that this drive won't do the job. Thank you so much for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, click like, click subscribe to learn more. I've done loads of M.2 SSD tests. Perhaps the next drive you look at is on there, or another one in your basket. Do check that out. But otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.